Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I'm doing a discussion of the book How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram x Kendi as part of my Social Justice Nonfiction project. I will link below about my project in case you wanted to know a little bit more about that. But basically in this video, I'm going to discuss some of the main ideas in this book. So this book as a premise is one that takes a look at what anti-racism is and how we can shift our thinking to think like an anti-racist. It also is a book that integrates a lot of Kendi's own experiences. It's a semi-memoir talking about how he had to fight against a lot of the internalized racism that he grew up with as a Black man in the US. So it's a very moving personal story as well as a nonfiction story that talks about these ideas. I'm going to focus on just the ideas of anti-racism in this video, but I do think that his personal memoir as part of the book is a very moving thing as well. So the first main idea that I want to talk about is what is anti-racism and what does it mean to be an anti-racist? So in this book, I really liked the way that Kendi defined anti-racism as well as racism. So basically, racism is anything that supports racial inequities. So supports policies, supports beliefs, anything that supports that difference in outcomes and in treatment of groups of different races. And he breaks racism down into two types. So first there's the segregationist racism. This is what I think we traditionally think of as racist. It's people who believe that there is a fundamental inherent inferiority in certain races, and that this is a permanent, biological, deep-rooted difference, and that any sort of inequities between races is completely justified because of that. Then there are the assimilationist type of racism. This is something that I think a lot of people don't see as racism, because assimilationist racism says that there are differences between races, but those differences are behavioral or cultural. There's something that can be changed. There's something that can be fixed. So, for example, assimilationists believe that maybe you have grown up in a bad surrounding and that has made you bad. So you might say, oh, well, there is a kid who grew up in the inner city who will become a criminal because of that unless we step in and educate and fix that person. But they're still buying into the idea that there is a difference between races and that some are superior to others, even if they're not necessarily calling it that. Anti-racism, on the other hand, says that any sort of inequities we see between racial groups is due to racist policies, not due to the inferiority of groups. So you don't need to fix people to be better. What you need to do is fix policies to actually give equal opportunities and equal resources to all groups. So in that previous example of if you have a kid in the inner city, the goal would not be to educate and reform the kid. The goal would be to change the system to give proper funding to inner city schools, or to properly fund social services, or to reduce over-policing, or to change the criminal justice system so that it doesn't unfairly impact Black bodies. So that's the idea of anti-racism. It says you just reject the idea that there's any sort of inferiority in any racial group, and instead you focus on the policies and how those are creating inequities. The next big idea that Kendi talks about is racism as a construct. He talks about the origins of racism and really the concept of race, which was invented to basically justify the slave trade. So in the 15th century, when the Portuguese started mass enslaving people from Africa, they needed some sort of moral justification for why it was okay for them to make all of this money on enslaving all sorts of people. And the reason that they came up with was that, oh, those people are barbarians, they're inferior. They are a race of people who are less worthy than our race, and we should civilize them, and so forth and so on. And so it was actually something that was created not that many hundreds of years ago in order to justify really self-interest and money and politics. And he talks about this. He talks about how there is no biological justification, about how often what happens is you have a group who is in power who wants something out of self-interest, money or more power, and they create these policies that are racist and come up with racist ideas to justify them, to make it okay. And he talks about things like eugenics, which was a whole science that was created to justify things like slavery, and it was bunk science. They were just, measuring skull size and saying, oh, well, clearly white people have bigger skulls and therefore are more intelligent and therefore don't need to be enslaved, all sorts of things like that. So the idea of racism is just totally made up, but in terms of something that has affected people historically and socially and continues to affect people, it's very much real. So it is just an idea. It's not a real biological concept, but it is something that has been made real through its widespread belief, the way that people buy into it, and the way that people treat others. And I just really like, he has a quote about this. He says, "The source of racist ideas was not ignorance and hate, but self-interest. The history of racist ideas is the history of powerful policymakers erecting racist policies out of self-interest, then producing racist ideas to defend and rationalize the inequitable effects of their policies, while everyday people consume those racist ideas, which in turn sparks ignorance and hate." So he just really talks about how racism is a construct, but it is used very effectively to convince people that it's just that we have these inequities. Another of the big ideas that Kendi explores in this book is that of hierarchy. So people who are in power and who create racist policies through self-interest basically try to set up a system of hierarchy, kind of a ladder of superiority, where some people are on top and some people are on bottom. And it justifies the inequities in the treatment of people through saying, where are you on this ladder? And when you believe that there are certain groups who are more deserving or better or superior in some way, you're buying into the idea of the hierarchy. And he talks about how this plays into a lot of kind of intersectional identities. So in addition to race, where you have a ranking of races, so maybe you have white and then Asian and then brown and then black, you also have this intersection with ethnicity, with class. So maybe you have rich black people above poor black people, with gender, with sexuality, with color. You have all of these different intersections where even if you're somebody who's lower than someone else on the ladder, you can still feel superior to somebody else who's even lower on the ladder. And he really talks about how we have to reject the idea of hierarchy altogether. We cannot buy into the idea that some people are superior to others. We have to believe that everybody, regardless of what kind of differences they have in the way they live their lives or the way they look, is equal. They are inherently equal, and the thing that kind of creates inequity is racist policies. And the last main idea that I want to talk about from this book is that of activism. So Kendi argues that if we acknowledge that everybody is equal and that differences do not imply inferiority or superiority, and that the root cause of inequities are racist policies, then we have to go about activism in a different way. A lot of the activism that has been done up until this point fighting against racism has assumed that racism stems from ignorance or from immorality, and that what we need to do is educate people or shame them into being better. But Kendi argues that's not the source of the problem. The source of the problem is self-interest and power. And so what we need to do is attack those and start by focusing on policy changes, by electing policymakers who fight against inequities, and by really trying to change racist policies. So I think that that's a really interesting way of approaching activism, and I definitely liked his ideas, although I do think that he doesn't give you a ton of details about how to go about the activism. So that's very much on the reader to kind of figure out where to go next. He just gives a framing device for how to think about racism and racist policies. If you're totally new to how to get involved in activism, I think that one thing that you can do is watch the Netflix documentary, Knock Down the House, which I think talks about some of these grassroots campaigns within the Democratic Party to focus on change. And I think there's probably a ton of other resources out there as well. So if anybody else knows of any, please let me know down below. I'm definitely trying to work on being more involved in activism myself. Overall, I think that How to Be an Anti-Racist is a very good introduction to how to think about anti-racism, about how to conceptualize the way that racism plays out through racist policies, and to really see that as something that needs changing, that the policies themselves are what we need to be focusing on. So I really liked a lot of this book. I think it's a great introduction. If you're somebody who's already more familiar with the topic, it may be a little bit too introductory for you, but if you're new to it, I think this is an excellent place to start. If you guys have read this book, or if you have any recommendations for me or any comments or anything like that, please go ahead and leave me a comment down below.